Hello there, welcome to my review of the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, episode 4, The Mazarin Stone. In some ways, this episode represents the greatest departure from the source stories. Due to Jeremy Brett's failing health, he was unable to film for most of the episode, and so is replaced by Charles Gray as Mycroft. And it combines the Mazarin Stone with the three Garridebs into one, taking most of the story from the three Garridebs. And while this might seem odd, it's important to note that the original story for the Mazarin Stone was adapted from a play, and is all set in one location with very little for Watson to do, while the three Garridebs essentially borrows heavily from the Red-Headed League, so it makes sense to mix these two weaker stories into one. That being said, let's dive into the review. The episode begins with a brief prologue featuring Brett as Holmes, excusing himself from Baker Street as he travels to the Highlands for unclear purposes, before we move to a museum where the Mazarin Stone is on display, before being stolen. We then move on to Watson's surgery, where Watson is greeted by the two eccentric Garrideb sisters.
We're descended from good Anglo-Saxon stock,
whose brother taught Watson.
One of my university lecturers was called Garrideb.
He remembers you, Dr. Watson.
At first, he thinks they're there for a consultation, before they reveal they have a mystery that needs solving. Meanwhile, Mycroft is engaging in a case of his own, due to Holmes's absence, by the British government in finding the stolen jewel. Back with Watson, and the sisters are explaining that they had an American visitor claiming to also be a Garrideb, offering their brother a $5 million share of a $15 million bounty.
$5 million?
But they are convinced something is amiss, as the man doesn't have the distinct Garrideb family likeness. We then bounce back and forth between these two investigations, and while with prior knowledge it's obvious these are two different stories, they actually do a really good job of dovetailing them together, and making them feel as if they're two sides of a dual mystery. The Mycroft mystery seems fairly straightforward, as we saw who did it, Count Silvius, but being of noble blood, no one besides Mycroft thinks he could have possibly done it. The Watson mystery is a little more involved, as he visits the brother Nathan Garrideb, who explains what is going on. The American, John Garrideb, says he represents one Alexander Hamilton Garrideb, who was fascinated by their shared unusual name and vowed in his will that if John were to find two other male Garridebs, they would share in Alexander's $15 million fortune. John has found Nathan, but he hasn't been able to track down another. Nathan is even dottier than his sisters, and is completely convinced that the man speaks the truth. But the sisters are dubious and want Watson to look into it. Mycroft visits Count Silvius, already having a grudge with the man, and is all the more convinced of his guilt, disguising himself as a cab driver and dropping Silvius off at a jewel cutter and dealer. Watson, on the other hand, has an encounter with John Garrideb, initially threatening,
"I don't want the police butting into a private matter,"
before being disarmed by Watson.
The sooner we find a third male Garrideb, the better for all concerned.
Well, that puts it different.
However, this encounter only makes Watson all the more suspicious, when his story doesn't match what Watson observes. While this would have originally been Holmes's deductions, they actually work really well given to Watson having seen his own deductive abilities grow over the course of the show's 10-year run. We've seen him use and be tested on Holmes's methods and slowly improve, so it's well within the character arc that he should be able to work out at least some of what's going on here. And it's really heartwarming to see his character bloom in these conditions, in a way that is so rare for Watson across all the different Holmes adaptations. Mycroft, on the other hand, is not nearly as tested as he follows the activities of the brazen Silvius, checking in with the jewel cutter who Silvius approached to cleave a stone that sounded remarkably like the Mazarin stone. A job that the jewel cutter says he was unable to do in the time frame. What the episode adds to the story here is just how set in class standards the Victorians were. Mycroft is the only one willing to believe that a count could possibly commit such a crime, but lacking the proof of the stone itself, no one will take the chance of a scandal in arresting a titled man. As we see the Count hobnob with the royal family, still under the watchful eye of Mycroft, we discover John Garrideb has apparently found the final Garrideb, a Howard Garrideb who is apparently advertising in a Birmingham newspaper. But the syntax and the spelling of the advert is very much Americanized, clearly placed by John. However, the writers were unwilling to give this discovery to Watson, and it's up to the Garrideb sisters to find this clue. I personally think this is a bit of a mistake, as I really don't think it's beyond Watson's capabilities. But it doesn't ruin the flow of the episode. These two mysteries finally converge in Baker Street, as Mycroft visits for information on Count Silvius from Holmes's files, just before Silvius arrives himself, trying to find out what Mycroft knows and how much of a threat he is, before pointing out that without the stone, Mycroft has nothing.
One card is missing. Queen of Diamonds.
And Mycroft now has only one opportunity, and it's a long shot. He needs to track down the man who killed the only jewel cutter who could cleave the stone in time, and thanks to Inspector Bradstreet's photo library of the killer, James Winter, Watson is able to confirm that James Winter is none other than John Garrideb.
Alias Moorcroft, alias Evans, alias
John Garrideb.
It's revealed that the dead jewellery cutter, Pressbury, rented a room from the Garridebs, and that Nathan moved into that room when Pressbury disappeared, or rather, as we know, was murdered. Unable to convince Nathan not to travel to Birmingham in search of the fictitious Garrideb, Watson and Mycroft set themselves up in his room overnight to await Winter's arrival. Sure enough, Winter is coming, and with Watson and Mycroft hidden, reveals a trapdoor to a workshop where Pressbury had all his tools. It appears that Winter was Pressbury's assistant, and the only possible man able of cleaving the stone himself. As they confront Winter, he throws a cleave and injures Watson before confessing to the whole scheme in remorse. Pressbury planned the robbery 5 years ago, but was killed by Silvius in an argument, Winter taking the fall for it. He was Pressbury's assistant and was the only man who could potentially cleave the stone, although he still doesn't think he's up to it. He uses this storytelling as an opportunity to swipe the cleave and hold Watson to ransom, but is foiled by the sisters, realising in the process that Silvius has betrayed him and has decided to flee without cleaving the stone. While Watson receives medical attention, Mycroft takes after Silvius, catching him at the docks for a standoff, which leaves the Count flailing in the mud of the Thames and allows Mycroft to locate the stolen gem. This brings about the briefest of returns of Sherlock to congratulate his brother with both mysteries solved.
Bravo.
This is a really tricky episode for me to judge, as there are things that I love about it, like Watson being out on his own and competent, Mycroft truly showing himself to be a better detective than Sherlock, something which Holmes always claimed, and weaving two lacklustre stories into something better. I think the performances are fantastic. although John Finch's Count Silvius could have been shown to be even more villainous. The Garrideb sisters are particularly good value, as they don't really feature in the original story at all, but are perfectly fleshed out here and full characters, with certain shots hinting towards the type of people that they are. Where it does fall apart, though, is in the final act, as one brilliant aspect of the original Three Garrideb story is when Watson is injured, Holmes shows deep concern for his friend for putting him in what could have been a lethal situation, something that they have only ever skirted near previously. It's here where we see Holmes gets careless with the life of his friend and reacts accordingly bereft when Watson is injured. Obviously, with Mycroft replacing Sherlock, that scene is lacking the emotional impact. I'm also a bit annoyed with how the face-off between Silvius and Mycroft transpires, as Silvius fires at shadows, but those shadows are definitely Mycroft and camera trickery, making it appear as if Mycroft is Batman. This and the avant-garde way of filming the stone in the finale just don't work for me. If the rest of the episode had been like that, I might have understood it, but it felt like the director was getting a bit bored and thought he'd try some fancy setups which don't come off. For me, this is probably a 3 out of 5, as for everything I liked, it also has some pretty big faults. Thank you. Goodbye.